The sanctity of healing under fire. An introduction. Hospitals throughout history have stood as sanctuaries of healing, places where the wounded seek refuge and the sick find solace. Yet in the brutal reality of war, these beacons of hope often become targets themselves. The Israel-Palestine conflict, a protracted and bloody struggle, exemplifies this tragic phenomenon. Hospitals meant to mend and comfort are thrust into the heart of the conflict, their neutrality questioned and their safety compromised. This essay delves into the contentious issue of why hospitals are targeted in this conflict, exploring the justifications, the devastating consequences, and the urgent need for international intervention. Hospitals as battlegrounds, allegations of military exploitation. One of the most common justifications for targeting hospitals is the allegation that opposing forces utilize them for military purposes. Accusations fly from both sides of the Israel-Palestine divide. Israel claims that Hamas, the Palestinian militant group, uses hospitals as shields, storing weapons and launching attacks from within their premises. Conversely, Palestinians accuse Israel of deliberately targeting hospitals and medical personnel, viewing it as a tactic to weaken their resilience. The truth, often shrouded in the fog of war, becomes a casualty itself. The lack of clear evidence and the difficulty of independent verification exacerbate the problem. Each side points to incidents that bolster their narrative, further fueling the cycle of mistrust and violence. The Al-Aqsa Hospital strike, for example, remains a point of contention. Israel claimed it targeted militants operating within the hospital, while Palestinians decried it as a blatant attack on a civilian facility. The incident highlights the complexity of the issue and the difficulty of disentangling truth from propaganda. Crumbling foundations, disrupting medical care and morale. Regardless of the veracity of such allegations, the consequences of targeting hospitals are undeniably devastating. Hospitals, already strained by conflict, are pushed to the brink of collapse. Medical supplies dwindle, equipment is destroyed, and qualified personnel are killed or forced to flee. The capacity to provide even basic healthcare is severely hampered, leaving the most vulnerable, the sick, the injured, and the elderly, without access to life-saving treatment. Beyond the immediate physical toll, attacks on hospitals inflict deep psychological wounds. They erode trust in institutions meant to provide safety and care. Patients already grappling with the trauma of war are left terrified to seek medical help, fearing that hospitals themselves have become dangerous places. This fear ripples outward, impacting entire communities and eroding morale. The targeting of hospitals, therefore, becomes a tactic of war, designed not only to cripple physical infrastructure, but also to break the spirit of the population. Questionable justifications, military doctrines, and international law. The targeting of hospitals raises profound legal and ethical questions. International Humanitarian Law, a set of rules designed to mitigate the horrors of war, explicitly protects hospitals and medical personnel from attack. The Geneva Conventions, the cornerstone of international humanitarian law, clearly state that civilian hospitals organized to give care to the wounded and sick may in no circumstances be the object of attack. Despite this clear prohibition, some military doctrines attempt to justify targeting hospitals by invoking the concept of dual-use infrastructure. This controversial doctrine argues that if civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, is being used for military purposes, it loses its protected status and becomes a legitimate military target. However, international humanitarian law requires that even in cases of doubt, the presumption should be in favor of civilian status. Furthermore, any attack must be proportionate and must not cause disproportionate harm to civilians. Critics argue that the dual-use justification is often used as a pretext to target hospitals. without sufficient evidence and without taking necessary precautions to minimize civilian casualties. Scars that run deep, psychological trauma and displacement. The psychological trauma inflicted by attacks on hospitals extends far beyond the immediate victims. The constant fear of being targeted, the loss of loved ones in places meant for healing, and the disruption of essential healthcare services leave lasting scars on individuals and communities. Children, in particular, are deeply affected, their sense of security shattered, their development jeopardized. The psychological toll of living under the constant threat of violence contributes to a climate of fear and despair. Furthermore, attacks on hospitals often lead to mass displacement. With hospitals either destroyed or deemed too dangerous, people are forced to flee their homes in search of safety and medical care. This displacement exacerbates the already dire humanitarian situation in conflict zones, putting further strain on resources and increasing the vulnerability of displaced populations. A moral reckoning, the debate on legality and ethics. The targeting of hospitals in the Israel-Palestine conflict, regardless of the justifications provided, has sparked international outrage and condemnation. Human rights organizations have documented a pattern of attacks on medical facilities, accusing both sides of violating international law. The United Nations has repeatedly called for investigations into alleged war crimes and urged all parties to respect the sanctity of healthcare. Beyond the legal debate lies a profound moral question. Can the deliberate targeting of hospitals, places dedicated to alleviating suffering, ever be justified? Critics argue that such actions represent a fundamental breach of human decency, a descent into barbarity that undermines the very fabric of civilized society. They argue that the consequences of such actions, the loss of innocent lives, the erosion of trust, and the long-term psychological trauma, far outweigh any perceived military advantage. The Al-Aqsa Hospital strike, a case study in controversy. The 2023 airstrike on the Al-Aqsa Hospital in Gaza stands as a stark example of the complexities and controversies surrounding this issue. The strike resulted in numerous casualties, including patients, medical staff, and civilians seeking refuge within the hospital. Israel claimed that the strike targeted Hamas militants operating within the hospital, while Palestinians vehemently denied these allegations, calling it a deliberate attack on a civilian facility. The incident sparked international condemnation, with the United Nations calling for an independent investigation. However, the lack of access for independent investigators and the competing narratives from both sides made it difficult to establish a definitive account of events. The Al-Aqsa Hospital strike serves as a tragic reminder of the high stakes involved and the urgent need for accountability when hospitals are targeted in conflict zones. The price of silence? The urgent need for accountability. The lack of accountability for attacks on hospitals perpetuates a dangerous cycle of impunity. Without consequences for violations of international law, warring parties are more likely to view hospitals as legitimate targets, further endangering civilians and undermining the sanctity of humanitarian principles. The international community has a moral and legal obligation to investigate allegations of war crimes and hold perpetrators accountable, regardless of their affiliation. Establishing accountability is not only crucial for achieving justice for victims, but also for deterring future attacks. When perpetrators know that their actions will have consequences, they are less likely to engage in such egregious violations. Accountability, therefore, serves as a vital mechanism for upholding international law and protecting civilians in conflict zones. Protecting the vulnerable, a call for international action. Addressing the complex issue of hospitals being targeted in the Israel-Palestine conflict requires a multifaceted approach that goes beyond condemning individual incidents. The international community must take concrete steps to ensure the protection of healthcare workers, facilities and patients caught in the crossfire. This includes providing increased funding for the protection of hospitals, strengthening mechanisms for monitoring and reporting violations of international humanitarian law, and supporting the work of humanitarian organizations providing medical care in conflict zones. Furthermore, the international community must exert pressure on both sides to respect their obligations under international law and to ensure the safe and unimpeded access of humanitarian aid to those in need. Towards a future of peace, ensuring the safety of healthcare. Ultimately, the only sustainable solution to protecting hospitals in the Israel-Palestine conflict lies in achieving a just and lasting peace. As long as the conflict persists, hospitals and other civilian infrastructure will continue to be caught in the crossfire. The international community must play an active role in facilitating meaningful dialogue between the two sides, addressing the root causes of the conflict, and working towards a future where hospitals are once again seen as sanctuaries of healing, not battlegrounds in a protracted war. The targeting of hospitals in any conflict represents a failure of humanity. It is a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of war and the urgent need to uphold the principles of international law and human dignity. In the words of former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, there is no peace without respect for human rights. Ensuring the safety of hospitals and healthcare workers is not merely a legal obligation, but a moral imperative, a testament to our commitment to a world where even in the midst of conflict, humanity prevails.